Hey, everybody, welcome into episode 137 of the Leaning into Leadership podcast. My guest on the show today is Kurtis Hewson. And if you don't know Kurtis, let me tell you this about him. He's an award-winning former administrator and teacher, as well as a teaching faculty member at the post-secondary level. Kurtis is the co-founder of Jigsaw Learning and the co-author of the book Collaborative Response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners. Kurtis currently works with districts and schools all over the globe, helping them to establish the collaborative response framework in their schools. Folks, every child in our schools deserves to feel like they have a team around them, supporting them and helping them achieve at the highest levels. That, honestly, is what the collaborative response is all about. I sat down and had a conversation with Kurtis recently, and honestly, Kurtis and I did a home and home. I was on his podcast, he was on mine. I'll make sure and link his podcast in the show notes so you can go and check out the episode with me, along with a bunch of his other podcast episodes. But we talked at length about some of those pieces that get in the way of us ensuring that our students are as successful as they possibly can be, and how we can get our PLCs to really transform learning in our schools. It's a fantastic episode, folks, and I can't wait for you to check it out. Before we go to that, just real quick, I want to share with you my favorite new book. This book right here, Be the Cause, an Educator's Guide to Effective Instruction. This book comes from Josh Korb. Josh has put together an incredible book that is loaded with instructional strategies and ways that you can transform what happens in your classroom to increase student engagement and obviously to increase student learning. It's a fabulous book. I've got it linked in the show notes. Make sure you check it out. Now, let's get to that conversation with Kurtis Hewson. You're going to catch it all right after this. I find myself from time to time reflecting on my time as both an assistant principal and as a principal, and really wanting to lean into that instructional leadership space. Obviously, I talk with leaders all the time. I talk here on the show all the time about we have to be intentional about being instructional leaders. We can't just simply wait and hope that the instruction changes as a result of us doing student discipline or managing a budget. There's so much more to it than that. And upon reflection, one of the big pieces, one of the big transformations that took place in my leadership career was diving into the professional learning communities movement. Yeah. Now, I've talked here on the show a few times about the intent behind the PLC and about how we've kind of gone maybe a little further on the PLC movement than we should. And by that I mean, sometimes it's, well, if we just PLC, then we'll fix everything. As if PLC is some kind of a verb and not an actual structure. So today on the show, folks, I'm really excited to have Kurtis Hewson joining me, because Kurtis has taken that PLC work and really dug deep and really gotten into the nuts and the bolts and the core of how we truly collaborate. Kurtis is the co-author, along with his wife Lorna, of a new book called Collaborative Response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners. Folks, buckle up, because we are talking about truly responding to the needs of our learners today. Kurtis, thank you for joining me here on the show.
Thanks, Darrin. It's a real pleasure to be able to engage in a conversation with you. Really excited about this.
Yeah, 100%, man. And, to have those instructional conversations, we talk here on Leaning into Leadership all the time about all kinds of different facets of leadership. But we don't spend a lot of time diving into the instructional piece. And it's interesting, actually. I'm just thinking of this as I'm saying it, that the average principal probably spends about 11 or 12% of their total time on instructional leadership. And that's not because they're not trying, but that's just what the research tells us. And so interestingly, that's about the amount of time that I'm spending on Leaning into Leadership, talking about instructional leadership. So I need to up my game. So I'm really glad you're here to hold me accountable to what I believe is number 4 of my 6 being focused on instructional leadership. So let's do this really quick, Kurtis, before we just start chasing my wild ramblings. Let's maybe jump in the Wayback Machine a little bit and help my learners, my listeners, the folks that are tuned in, kind of, I guess, have a little orientation around who Kurtis is. Go back to whenever in your career you would like to start that journey and share with them what brings you to the show today.
Yeah, so I'm located here in Central Alberta, Canada, and my education journey is over 25 years now as school administrator. I've taught at post-secondary level, but where the genesis of this story starts is I moved into leadership at a really, really young age. I think I was 25 when I had my first assistant principalship. I might have been 27 with the first principalship that I had. And it was when I moved into, and so came with that understanding right away of I by no means have all the right answers. I tried to go into the just bring me your problems and I'll try and fix everything because that's what good leaders do. It's what I thought at the time, but realized I am the least equipped person to be able to do this. What I need to be doing is creating systems and structures where we leverage the capacity that is throughout the building, not just sitting in one chair in the main office. And so it was when I moved into my second principalship where I was, I believe, the second youngest member of the staff team coming in as a principal and realizing that if we don't have really intentional structures to collaborate, to maximize the capacity that exists within this building, and we had great teachers doing great things for kids, but how could we really leverage these systems? I think that was my first foray. And at the time, I was also doing some master's work as well around instructional leadership and really focusing in on the idea of creating community and collaboration. And so it was a little bit of a godsend, I guess, in a sense that I couldn't rely upon more hierarchical ways or authoritarian ways of leading the school, because I could not be the person that said, I have 30 years of experience in the classroom, listen to me. I didn't. I had to create systems. And I think that was one of the key learnings. And to me, it's still at my core of our role, I think, as leaders is to create systems and then let good people do good work in those systems and structures and processes. I set the banks of the river, but then let the water flow. Don't try and micromanage that flow. And I guess that was kind of that history. And to answer your question, a little bit of my background as a leader and where some of the work around collaborative response first started to take hold.
I think there's just a lot of power in there, and I want to maybe go a little bit deeper. Have you elaborate a little bit more. And here's why I say this, specifically around as a young leader, as an early career leader, the necessity to create and establish systems. And here's why I want to go a little bit deeper. Right now, the leadership pipeline isn't empty, but people are just jetting through it at an unbelievably fast pace. And maybe the typical step into your first assistant principal or principalship at 32 is more and more common to see 28 or 27 or something like that. Just simply because so many positions have opened, so many people have moved on, and so forth. Not to slight anybody who's jumping into leadership roles early, but simply a little bit more support there. Talk a little bit more about why it's so important to build systems, to build structures, and allow your great people to do great work with inside of them.
Yeah, so again, I go back, and obviously I had to do that because I didn't have the toolbox that was deep enough instructionally to be able to do the one-to-one coaching and support. I had to create teams, but I think it's critical for our roles as leaders. And I don't care if it's young or I'm starting to chart the path on my retirement end of that, I think you have to focus on creating strong systems, strong structures, processes. I mean, it's what Dufour always used to talk about in regards to loose, tight leadership, right? That we're going to be tight on certain things. And I feel as a leader, I'm going to set structures and parameters that, of course, we're going to get feedback and they're going to evolve and adjust over time. But I can be forceful on the, well, forceful is not the right word. No, I can be tight to the parameters that we're going to work within, but then I'm not going to dictate the work within that. So it goes right back to the PLC notion of we focus in on those 4 questions, but I'm not the one responsible for answering all 4 of those. I just need to create the conditions to allow really good people to be engaged in answering those. And it became really clear to me too, as I started to work with larger and larger staff teams, that if we're not creating teams and systems and structures, I can't be the one-to-one coach for absolutely everyone in the building. That doesn't mean I negate that responsibility. Of course not. There's still times where I need to do that, but I can extend my support and leadership so much more succinctly through supporting teams and supporting good team structures in the building. And I think it was Rick Dufour, and maybe it was writing with either Michael Fullen or Marzano that really resonated with me in one of their books about focus on supporting teams rather than individuals, and you can see greater impact across an organization. And I've seen and lived that for sure.
You know, that type of philosophy is, I think, just so important for leaders because, you know, as leaders, you know, we definitely want to be that servant leader, and we want to, we want to support students, and you know, we support the students by supporting the individual teachers. But so many leaders are just, they're exhausted, they're burned out, they're worn out because of exactly the opposite of what you're talking about. If we're pouring like crazy into every single individual instead of focusing on teams, man, you know, when you lead a staff, like, I mean, I had a staff of 120 teachers.
Yeah.
You know, when you're leading that many, and if you're trying to pour into every single one of them individually, that's really difficult. But pouring into, say, 8 or 10 teams, or even dividing that across a leadership team of 3 or 4 or 5, that can then support the team and maybe the individuals within the team, it makes a big difference in just that level of exhaustion of a leader.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would imagine you probably had some times in your leadership experience where you were all in on every individual and not focused on the teams. Otherwise, that particular piece, and I'm almost positive it's Marzano that wrote that with Dufour, but I could be wrong also.
Yeah, no, I'm sure
you can't go wrong with any of them. I mean, you really can't. But definitely, it's Dufour driving the bus on that one. But yeah, when we do that, man, we wear ourselves out. Talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you have some experience with that. And then how'd you find your way out of it?
Yeah, so absolutely had that experience. And I know in another conversation you and I have had, you referred to it as the Superman syndrome. And I definitely tried that as a new leader, and it wasn't working. And I don't know if I recognized it first or if it was someone else recognizing it for me. But I think the exact quote, and it may have been when I was an assistant principal, and a principal saying, "You can't make your space a goose nest." And what do you mean by that? And he said, a space where someone can come in, squawk, leave a mess, and then walk away and expect you to clean it up. I thought that was a great analogy.
That's
for
fantastic.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was doing. Just tell me your problem and I'll take care of it, because that's how I help you. But it's the whole idea of, no, if we create systems and structures and ways to help support one another at different times. And I've come now to the understanding of, if you do that really well, you create an environment where every single adult in the building is an expert and a learner at the same time. And that's become a huge mantra of ours in this collaborative response work is every person has expertise, has something to give. And I don't care if you're in your first 6 months of teaching or you are much, much, much further along. I don't care if you're working as a paraprofessional with a child or the office assistant at the front. Everyone has expertise, but everyone is a learner as well. And we can all continue to grow our instructional toolboxes. But the best way to do that is together and through what I refer to as layers of team that we build up within our schools.
Yeah, and that's the perfect segue. It takes me right to some stuff that I wanted to get into. Combination of your experience, and then this wonderful book that you and Lorna have brought out into the world, the collaborative response book. And I know it's based on your collaborative response framework.
Mm-hmm.
And a comprehensive framework like this, a series of systems, of structures that lead to truly surrounding every kid with the type of support and encouragement that they need to be successful doesn't happen sitting on your couch and saying, "Hey, let's write a book." This comes
Mm-hmm.
from a core experience. So we'll get to the book in a minute, but let's talk about what that core experience was that led you to say, "All right, we've got to build some structures to ensure that we're taking care of all of our kids."
Yeah, of course. And so I want to start this little piece off of one of the guiding um, slogans, I guess, or tagline that we really reinforce in this work is the idea of every child deserves a team. And to me, that's right at the core. And a school can say that the same way a school can say, we're committed to lifelong learning. But how do you see that actualized in your practice? You and I have had this conversation before, too,
Yes, we
of
have. Yeah.
we can say it out loud, but if we don't see it in action, it's not really happening. And so I think every child, and not just our highest needs students and not just those in crisis, but every single child deserves a team. And that doesn't mean that we create individualized program plans for every single child within our building, but we create really sophisticated structures of teams so that there is absolutely no way that one child's success is reliant on one individual within the building. Now, I love Rita Pearson's TED Talk where she talks about every child deserves a champion. I believe in that, but I would take it one further to say every child actually deserves a team. And within that, we can have our champions as well. So the early iterations of this is within the school. I had mentioned the second school I had come into as a principal, great teachers, really good people, and they were operating in grade level teams. This was an elementary school. And in these grade level teams, they were doing PLCs. And for those that are listening, I just did the air quote around PLCs because it was not PLC work. It was let's come together, let's plan out who's going to bring muffins to next week's parent social. And are we done because I have things I could go do back in my classroom during this time? And again, to me, that wasn't a reflection on the individuals. It was a reflection on the structures. So we began to really get tight when you
Curtis,
had
hang on
grade level.
just 1 second.
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to have you say that again, and I want you to say it louder for the people in the back about it's not
Yeah.
about the individual, but about the structure. Please say that again.
Yeah, it is. And this was hugely apparent within the school. Good people doing good things, but if we didn't have the structures and the processes, we could be doing things that aren't having optimal impact for student success. And again, not their fault. And I say that over and over when we go back to the genesis story of this work is I don't blame a single person in the school for what it was that we were doing as we had kids slipping through the cracks, but not through anyone's lack of care or attention. It was all structural and processes. We didn't have systems that were well established and well understood. And you talk about clarity and intentionality. We were missing that.
Yeah, it just man, there's so much in there that both makes me smile, but then also takes me to, I don't know, a place of almost deep terror around some early PLC work as well.
Hmm.
When told, well, we need to PLC, I kind of referenced it off the top, but you air quoted it beautifully. Um, so often it's like, oh, well, PLCs are just this magical bullet. And, that's all DeFore did, right? He showed up at Adlai Stevenson and said, hey, we're going to PLC, and that just fixed everything. When the
Hmm.
reality is he created this beautiful, compelling vision. And just an element of that was what became known as the PLC, but it was having those intentional structures and those intentional meetings. And how do we best support every kid? And, it takes me to a place in your book. I'm going to flash to a couple parts in the book throughout the rest of this interview because
Hmm.
there's just some really strong stories. So, and my copy, folks, is it's a lot of the pages are dog-eared over and that kind of stuff because it's just that good. But early on in the first chapter, and I love this by the way, folks, in this book. Lots of different vignettes, lots of different, almost like case study type of stories that you could see. I mean, honestly, this what I'm going to share. I'm like, wow, I've sat in that meeting. The names were different, but I sat in that meeting, right?
And Darrin, I have to say the vignettes were really easy to write because they came from personal experiences with
Yeah,
names and situations maybe adjusted, but they were lived, not imagined.
right, absolutely. Yeah, and I know that anybody who picks this up and reads this is going to say, "Oh yeah, 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 I remember. Yeah, this one in my school was named John, or this one in my school was named Jenny, or whatever." But right away, I mean, you talk about looking at collaborative response, and you talk about a teacher who gets a brand new student partway through. And as an individual teacher, she goes above and beyond.
Oh,
She got a
great
little bit of
teacher.
information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Heck yeah. I mean, this is a teacher that in anybody's school, you're saying, wow, she's a rock star. She's going above and beyond. She's trying to figure out this new kid, but man, this kid's reading level is so low. But then the adjoining vignette is about a school that has same situation, but all of those structures and systems are in place. How do we talk as a team about a kid that is struggling? How do we as a team talk about and brainstorm ideas to support this child? And how do we surround him with a team as opposed to just this one teacher who is, again, pouring herself into this kid? There's no question the way this is written. And actually, it loops back to what we were talking about administrators, right? The administrator who, instead of supporting a team, is supporting an individual. It's just replicated here. So
Yeah.
I've talked more about this than I want to. I want you to talk about like this particular piece because to me, it's a great launching point into what that collaborative response process looks like.
Yeah. So, Darrin, I don't know if you would have noticed, it's a little subtlety that the names of the school are really, really intentional. That one is referred to as Castaway Elementary, and
Yeah.
it came from the Tom Hanks movie where you're all alone on an island doing your absolute best, all that you can. And the other one is, I think is it Robinson?
It's Robinson. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the idea is Swiss Family Robinson. We're all working together. We're going to help support. Different people are going to have different strengths at different times to help support us, and that's really all about it. I've seen it, I've lived it, and I hear it over and over again. That with the complexities we have in this profession, if you are that really good teacher that's going above and beyond, doing all that you can, and I would say every person is trying to do the best that they can, but it's a recipe for burnout if you're trying to do that on your own. You can't do it. And I would suggest, and again, some of Marzano's earlier research pointed to that great teacher in a school that lacks structures and processes is going to hit a ceiling, and they are also going to reach a point of burnout, disengagement, or even they're out the door, they're going somewhere else. Where you put that same person in fact, I would go so far as to say someone less experienced or less particular expertise at this point into a system and set of structures, not only will we see greater outcomes for students, but I would suggest probably what's more important is the greater support for the adults. And if you can support the adults in a really, really effective ways, of course, that's going to have them better equipped to ensure the greatest amount of success for each and every child. I believe that to my core to be the case.
Well, yeah, because you're increasing their own self-efficacy.
Yeah.
They're not seeing pockets of success; they're seeing classrooms of success. They're actually going to a place where those statements, the lifelong learning or the all students can achieve, actually are believed, are actually coming to fruition because everybody's pulling on the same end of the rope. And when you and I've had this conversation before, and I've kind of referred to it already a little bit, but when that compelling vision that the leader is creating, when everybody buys in, and again, I don't really care for the word buy-in, but when everybody feels their part, when they know what their role is on the team as part of achieving that big vision, that grand vision, it's incredible how they feel a greater sense of self-efficacy and self-actualization, and that just leads to feeling much more rewarded in the work that you're doing. I think it's really interesting. Again, having lived the PLC journey and working with so many schools across the country now that everybody wants to PLC, but some do pretty good work. Some have really good structures in place, and yet at times, even with good structures, it's not really collaborative. It's more collegial. I know this is something you guys get into in the book too, and I'm curious, how do you push as the leader, or just as a team member for that matter, how do you push beyond collegial relationships and really get into that collaborative relationship?
I think it's, again, and we talk about it through the book and through the work when we're with schools, is you need a really deep sense of trust and vulnerability that happens in order to truly get to that true collaborative culture. And I reflect back on the school where this work first began, and I would say now we were very collegial in our interactions. And again, that was at nobody's fault. And by collegial, I meant everyone was there to support one another. People would come into somebody else's room. I'm struggling with this. Could you help me? Everyone was able to help. But when I think of true collaboration, it's when you and I can debate and disagree and still land at a better place than either one of us could have got to on our own. And that only happens when you set up structures and processes that can feel really mechanical and really awkward when we're first putting them in place. And again, a lot of this is not new. The idea of you need to have norms clearly established. We need to clearly articulate how will we actually disagree in a purposeful way. When we come together and meet, do we have roles established where I know exactly what I'm doing in this meeting, you know what you're doing? And again, sometimes I hear schools say, well, that's seriously, we have to set roles. And yeah, you do, until it becomes just practiced process for us. And it was through that constant evolution of realizing having just a grade level team that is working in a PLC work. And again, this is not about dismissing PLC work. It's about, I think, building upon it. Is, yes, that's great for the 3 or 4 people that you're in, but now how do we start creating cross-layered collaboration for us? And this is where we've actually seen the work take the greatest impact, probably at high schools now, where we see the huge ahas happen, is that I'm not just engaging with those that I share a common teaching assignment, which is typically what happens in work that's related to professional learning communities. But through our layers of team, I create situations where, as a high school humanities teacher, I might be put into a conversation about the needs of students with somebody who's teaching cosmetology, with somebody who is a phys ed teacher. And now we're creating circumstances where I have to be vulnerable in my teaching practice. And through that vulnerability, we start to create greater networks across schools. We often talk about it as through the layering, we start to see meshing of collaboration so that it's not just I'm part of this single PLC team, but it is truly a culture that is doing two things simultaneously. It's responding to the needs of students, which anyone who has experience around response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support can see some parallels. And we were definitely influenced and informed by that work for sure. So we want to be able to ensure no student slips through the crack, and we have tiers of support, but we're also doing it in a way that is building everybody's collective toolbox, one conversation at a time, that, again, we reach a incredibly robust culture of collaboration that's responding to the needs of students, but doing it in a way that everybody's getting stronger over and over again. It's not about, I have my group, and I'm doing things in my PLC, but there's a few students that I have to send to somebody else. These are the responsibility of somebody else within the school, and no, they're all our responsibility. And how can we leverage the expertise that exists within our building at a much higher level?
Help me with this a little bit. So, how do we grow from simply one, maybe fairly functional PLC? I won't go right to highly functional, but even just a fairly functional PLC group, a PLC team, to multi-layered teams. Now I actually want to ask this question from the leadership perspective, but not what does the leader do, but how does a leader grow the individuals and the teams? What professional development, what support, what questions does a leader ask to help pull back that resistance that's inevitable when, well, you asked me to do one team, I'm doing that, and now you want me to do this, and you want me to do this. There's a lot of culture building there. There's a lot of professional development there. There's all of those elements. It's a huge and probably too wide of a question for 30 minutes into a podcast, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I'm curious.
I think this is, from a leadership perspective, adopting a ready, fire, aim mentality becomes so critical. And then reinforcing that with our teams, it's essentially that entrepreneurial spirit of, we're going to try something, we're going to see if it works, and then we're going to evolve and take the next step, and being really clear from a leadership perspective. And we talk about this when we're working with leaders who are putting the approach in place in their schools. Adopt this mindset and let people know it's not going to be perfect, probably at any point, because it's growing. If we truly think of ourselves as a collaborative organization, we should see ourselves as learners and a learning organization that is evolving and growing as well. So to come back to your original question, I think putting that in place and understanding, I do not have to convince people necessarily when starting, but I just have to convince to, let's try this. And if it doesn't work, we will adjust, we will try, but we're going to fire. And we're going to learn so much through that firing approach. And part of the firing may be that when we go to aim, realize we were really off the mark with this particular structure. So I do think too that it's through that firing when people start to see purpose, and that this truly is helping me. And that's what we hear over and over and over again, is even a person who is highly resistant to giving up any ounce of time within, like, time is so critical to us. But if I can see that a 45-minute meeting was actually highly productive, I left with more things in my toolbox that are going to help me better outside, then I can't wait for that next time if it can be effective and productive. And I know that that's not always the case in every school, that when you say, all right, we're meeting next week, to have everybody go, oh, good, I can't wait for it to come up, rather than, oh, seriously, one more meeting? And we talk about in the work how by introducing a really specific structure that we refer to as a collaborative team meeting, we're actually going to reduce the number of meetings in our school by getting really focused and intentional in the ones that we're doing, which is why the layers of team become so important.
So, in addition to just, if you're watching, you can look, but if not, just look this book up. Hit it. It's in the link in the show notes, folks. I've got a link in there for it. In addition to just get this book in your hands, if I'm an early career leader, if I'm a leader who just took over a school here recently or is getting ready to when the next school year comes, what are one or two steps? Because you can't go from I just walked in the door to, hey, we're crushing this book, right? I mean, that just doesn't happen overnight. What are one or two steps that a leader should take to begin this journey in their school, assuming that those structures and processes are not currently in place?
Yeah, I would suggest there's two things that I would recommend based on a number of years of this within my own school and then coaching a lot of schools through this work now. We are at a place where about 80% of our province of Alberta, of the school jurisdictions, are adopting this work. So I've seen it play out in a lot of contexts now. The first thing I would say is don't do it alone, create a lead team. And that lead team, I would suggest, be made up of formal and informal leaders. So when I work with school jurisdictions and we're going to look at implementing across the system, one of the things that I put as one of my requirements is I'm not coming in to help unless a principal is part of the lead team that is going to engage in this. Because if they're not bought in, if they see this as, well, this is more of a special ed model, so I'll get my key person in that area to be the one leading it. No, I need a principal, but then we want a lead team where it might be other administrators, it might be key informal leaders within your school. You know, that super hub person that is going to have influence in a teaching staff who may not have a formal position title, but is somebody that is going to help be able to lead this work. And it's through that lead team that we take a little bit of that ready, fire, aim approach of we'll learn, we'll try something with our staff, we'll come back, we'll reflect on it, then we'll take the next step back to our staff, and a little bit of that iterative learning cycle, but that the lead team is a couple steps ahead of where the staff is, without saying, as a lead team, we're going to take 3 years to plan it out perfectly before we ever introduce to our staff team. So that would be my first one. The second one that I would say is start the collaborative team meeting. So we talk about in the book a very, very specific structure that to me is the linchpin of the whole work. And Darrin, if you can give me just a couple minutes, I'll very briefly describe what it looks like in practice.
Absolutely.
It looks like you're talking about students, but actually you're just using the student to leverage a conversation about practice. So here's what it would look like. I would, as a facilitator in the meeting, say, Darrin, who's a student you've brought, and as quickly as possible, what's a key issue? And Darrin would say, I've brought Rahit, and to me, right now, the key issue is difficulty with multi-step problems. That's it. Okay, I don't want to hear Rahit's backstory. I don't want to hear everything that you've tried, and this is why the structure becomes really important. Now, as a facilitator or others in the room, we might have to ask a couple questions like, what do you mean when you say multi-step? What does that look like? Because a key issue might be buried underneath what you're seeing or presenting. But let's say that I ask you, do you think it's a language comprehension issue, or is it a logical sequential thinking? And you say it's when the problem has 3 steps to get to the end, he can't envision what the 3 steps are. It's not a language. Okay, so the key issue is logical sequencing of steps when problem solving. And you say, yep. Then we turn all the direction away from you as teacher and from the student. And we say to others in the room, who else has a student who has difficulty with logical sequential thinking when it comes to problem solving? And this is where, especially in a high school, the key issue might be something that is shared in different course disciplines. It may not look the same, but I can identify someone in my gym class who has the same logical thing when it comes to performing a layup. They can't get the sequential thinking for that. And we want to identify other students so that it's not a student about just, or so it's not a conversation about just Darrin's practice or about Rahit as the learner. Then when we say, all right, for these 5 students that we've identified, what do we do when a student has difficulty creating logical sequencing? Go. And at this point, we brainstorm. And we say, well, one of the things I've tried before is I try chunking my work. And someone else will ask, what do you mean by chunking? What does that look like? And I'll describe it. And someone else will say, I like that idea. What if you were to take a highlighter and had the student highlight the key things? And somebody else jumps in and says, I do that, but I use my smartboard and I demonstrate it for them. And then I have the student come up to do that. In that conversation, there's going to be people in the room going, well, duh, doesn't everybody do that? But then there's also going to be people going, that's gold. I never thought about bringing the student up to my board because we know this profession is really complex. If I can fill my toolbox with different strategies or ideas, that's great. So we do that brainstorming, and in time, we develop what we call continuums of support so that the brainstorming doesn't have to be just off the top of our heads. We could be consulting our continuums to offer ideas and suggestions. And then we come back and say, all right, Darrin, for Rahit, what's one thing that you're going to try and take away from this practice? And typically, when first starting, teachers will pick low-hanging fruit, things like I was already going to do this, or I'm really comfortable with this particular strategy, so put me down for that. But what we see through the process is people start stretching. They start, you might hear an idea from me and say, I really like Kurtis's idea, but I'm going to need some help figuring out how to do that. And so that particular meeting becomes so solutions focused and action oriented, where before I've had the experience of coming into that meeting and it's a half hour talking about all the things going wrong in Rahit's life, you telling me everything you've done under the sun, people in the room saying, Darrin, you could try this, you could try this. And you, in best case scenario, might be saying, no, that I've tried that, it doesn't quite work. In worst case, you're thinking in your head, do you not think I'm competent in my job? The things you're suggesting are kind of 101. Of course, I've tried that. We take all of that personalization away from it. And like I said, it looks like you're talking about kids, but really you're just creating really robust ways to have conversation about practice for us. And it's through that process that we see deeper and deeper and deeper levels of collective efficacy that start to emerge within the school, and collaboration. And if you get really good at that key issue process, the people around the room could change. So we often say collaboratively plan, or do PLC work with those that you share a common teaching experience, whether it's the age of the students or the courses that you're teaching, but collaborative team meet with people who you don't. Diversity of thought, and we create multiple layers of collaboration through that process. Sorry, that was really long-winded, but to me, that meeting structure is one of our hugest ahas. And right away, it's the thing that teachers sink their teeth into and go, that conversation helped me.
Well, the power there is you are talking about pedagogy, you are talking about practice, but it's not personal. It's collectively, hey, do anybody else have this same struggle? Probably everybody. And okay, hey, what are some different practices we're doing with that? And then come back to me with, is there one here you might want to try? Heck yeah. I mean, if I respect my colleagues, even if I just respect one of my colleagues in the room to start with, it's going to be, hey, I'll go with this one. You're right. It might be low hanging fruit, but it might also be, I heard something that makes me go,
interesting.
That could work.
And this is
I
where
could see that fitting my toolbox,
right. And this is where we talk then about everybody in those conversations is a learner and an expert at the same time, but it's still teachers owning the process. It's not me as a leader saying, Darrin, I think you should through the conversation. It's okay. Here's something I want to try in my practice. So it's continually growing. And this was where we were so excited when some of John Hattie's research came out and started talking about this thing called collective efficacy and the huge impact that it has, where, oh my goodness, that just gave language to what we had been experiencing as a school a long time ago. The idea that we know we're having an impact and we can also evidence what it is that we do over and over and over again.
Oh, such a powerful conversation. I just love every bit of this. And again, I mean, that opportunity to talk about instructional leadership is just fantastic. We have, though, reached the point in the show, Kurtis, where I've got to ask you the same final question I ask everybody here on the show. I'd love to just keep this conversation going. I really would. We'll just have to have you come back and we'll talk about this a little bit more. But this is the Leaning Into Leadership podcast. So, Kurtis, right now, and you've mentioned a lot of things already, but what is something you're doing to lean into leadership?
You posed this, and I've heard it before on your podcast, so I've been prepping myself for this. And I think at this point in life and career, it's really two things. The first is understanding as a leader, I'm responsible for establishing systems or supporting and building systems, not alone, but with others. But when you create effective systems, you let good people do good work within those systems. And like I said, that whole analogy of set the banks of the river and then let the water flow, that's just become so incredibly clear on it being an important concept for us as leaders, to not try and micromanage the flow of the water, just create the banks. I think the second one is something I've alluded to already, is just modeling the human side of leadership. And what I mean by that is recognizing I don't have all the answers. How do I model as a leader vulnerability? Not weakness, but vulnerability, to be able to say, I'm having a hard time, or I'm struggling with this. How can I help, and reach out for that help? But with that, then that growth mindset and that desire to be continually learning and growing and sharing that learning. I think as leaders, if you're not engaging in that work with a growth mindset, we're going to be incredibly limited by how far we can go in our leadership.
Excellent stuff. Thank you so much for that response. I really appreciate that. Just really quick, Kurtis, where can people find the book and how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, I would say the easiest way is through the website jigsawlearning.ca. And my email address is kurtis.hewson@jigsawlearning.ca. I assume we'll throw it into the show notes. Yeah, we have a lot of information and a lot of resources and samples, freebies on the website to dig into this work a little further. I'm also going to share with you, Darrin, to throw into the show notes, if possible, a free little article, an overview of collaborative response. We often say the work is simplexity at its finest, simple in its design, but really complex in its actualization. And yeah, those might be some great places for people to start.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll make sure that everything is down there in the show notes, folks. I'll make sure and highlight the free download of that article so you can check it out. Again, Kurtis, I really appreciate you joining me here on the Leaning Into Leadership podcast.
Great. Thanks so much, Darrin. Really appreciate the opportunity to connect once again and chat.
Absolutely. All right, just an outstanding conversation there with Kurtis Hewson. Again, I really appreciate him coming on the show. Folks, all that great stuff is down in the show notes. Make sure you go and check that stuff out. But now it's time for a pep talk. Earlier this week, May 1st, it was School Principals Day National Principal Appreciation Day, if you will. And I reached out to a bunch of my principal friends. I reached out to the principals that I'm coaching and that I'm working with on all different parts of the country, and just shared, my thoughts and appreciation for the work that they do each and every day. I mean, the reality is principals are faced with some unbelievable challenges, considerably different challenges than when I was a building principal a handful of years ago. I recently had a conversation with someone and just asked him, what do you see as the biggest challenges for a principal today? And of course, they shared things like, dealing with student mental health and well-being. They talked about equity and inclusion. They talked about the challenges with teacher recruitment and retention. They talked about, things that connect to digital learning, technology integration. And of course, they talked about accountability and assessment. But the most important thing and the biggest thing that I heard that really stood out to me was their own self-care, their own mental well-being, and how, as a principal, it's so easy to chase every single thing, to try to fix every single thing. And I know that's how I behaved. I know that's how I led from that position. But the truth is, as school leaders, you've got to set that time aside to take care of yourself. We've all heard the phrase, we've all probably quoted that we can't pour from an empty cup, but it's true. Individuals, as principals, have got to take care of themselves. It's a huge, huge piece, folks. Whatever it might be, if that means you need to find somebody to sit and talk with, if you've got a friend that you can go and spend time with regularly, maybe it's a therapist or a life coach that you want to work with so that you're able to download some of those pieces. It isn't just as simple as turning off the cell phone when you go home. You've got to be able to download all of those things that you're carrying with you. So my pep talk this week, honestly, is I want you to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, because you can't take care of everybody else when you're not in a good place. So take it for what it's worth. Thank you so much for listening to and watching the Leaning into Leadership podcast. Get out there. Have a road to awesome day.